The mud looked harmless in the darkness. At 5:40 in the morning on October 14, 1942, a Soviet T-34 76 rolled across a rain-soaked field west of Stalingrad. The engine roared, the tracks clawed at the earth, water splashed against the hull. Inside the tank, 4 men sat in near-total darkness, listening to the grinding sound of steel and mud. They believed speed and armor would carry them through. They believed the German line ahead was weaker than it really was.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Then the left track stopped biting. The tank slowed. The engine screamed louder. The hull twisted. And in the next second, the 30-ton machine was no longer moving. You can almost feel the silence inside the turret. The driver forcing the levers. The commander staring through his periscope. The gunner holding his breath. Outside, the rain drummed on steel. Ahead, hidden beyond the mist and the tree line, a German Panzer IV had already found them. At exactly 5:41 a.m., a flash burst from the darkness. The first shell struck before the Soviet crew could fire. That single moment captured one of the harsh truths of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. It did not matter how famous your tank was. It did not matter how thick your armor looked on paper. If you lost momentum in mud, if you exposed your position for even a few seconds, the enemy would seize the initiative, and whoever fired first usually survived. This is the story of a T-34 76 that became trapped in the mud near Stalingrad, and the Panzer IV that turned those few seconds into a deadly advantage. It is a story of machines, but more importantly, it is a story of the men inside them. Men who could hear every shell, smell every spark, and know that one small mechanical failure could become their last moment alive. By the autumn of 1942, the Eastern Front had become a war of exhaustion. The German advance into southern Russia had reached the Volga River. Stalingrad was burning. Entire factories had been reduced to rubble. Every street, warehouse, and railway line had become contested ground. But the battle was not limited to the city itself. West and south of Stalingrad, armored forces clashed across open fields and muddy steppes as both sides tried to cut supply routes and seize high ground. The weather was as dangerous as the enemy. Weeks of rain transformed roads into swamps. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses collapsed under supply wagons. Tanks that looked unstoppable on dry ground became vulnerable if they lost traction. In this environment, crew skill and patience mattered as much as armor thickness. The Soviet T-34 76 was already earning a fearsome reputation. Introduced in 1940, it shocked German commanders during the invasion of the Soviet Union. Its sloped 45mm armor could deflect many early anti-tank rounds. Its 76.2mm gun was powerful enough to destroy most German tanks at normal combat ranges. Wide tracks gave it better mobility over snow and soft ground than many foreign designs. To Soviet crews, the T-34 was a symbol of survival and resistance, but it was not perfect. Visibility inside the early T-34 was poor. The commander often doubled as the gunner, forcing one man to search for targets and aim the weapon at the same time. Radios were not always reliable. The two-man turret created heavy workloads under combat conditions. And although its tracks were wide, even the T-34 could become trapped when deep mud combined with shell craters and steep slopes. Facing it was the German Panzer IV, a tank that had quietly evolved into one of the most effective armored vehicles of the war. Earlier models had short-barreled guns designed for infantry support. By 1942, new variants carried the long 75mm KW K-40 cannon, capable of penetrating T-34 armor at increasingly longer distances. German optics were excellent. Crew roles were clearly separated. Commanders enjoyed better visibility, and radios allowed tighter coordination. The Panzer IV was not as revolutionary as the T-34, but it was balanced, dependable, and lethal in experienced hands. The Soviet crew in this story belonged to the 84th Tank Brigade, a one of several formations committed to repeated attacks against German positions west of Stalingrad. Their tank, factory number partially obscured by mud, had left the assembly lines only weeks earlier. The olive paint was still fresh beneath the grime. On the turret, a white tactical number stood out against the dark steel. Junior Lieutenant Ivan Sokolov, 24 years old, commanded the vehicle. Before the war, he had studied mechanical engineering in Kharkov. Sergeant Mikhail Antonov served as driver. He was known for his ability to coax movement from engines others considered dead. Loader Alexei Voronin, broad-shouldered and calm under pressure, handled the heavy 76mm rounds. Radio operator and hull machine gunner Pavel Yegorov sat in the front beside the driver, monitoring communications and scanning for infantry threats. They had survived 2 months of continuous combat. The German crew waiting ahead belonged to the 24th Panzer Division. Their Panzer IV Aus FG sat in partial concealment behind a line of autumn trees overlooking a muddy depression. Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner commanded the tank. He was a veteran of France and the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. Gunner Hans Richter had a reputation for fast and accurate shooting. Driver Otto Weiss kept the vehicle perfectly aligned for rapid engagement. Loader Dieter Falk and radio operator Ernst Kohler completed the crew. They had spent the night motionless, engines off, listening to rain strike the turret roof. At 4:50 a.m., German forward observers reported Soviet engines massing to the east. Brenner ordered armor-piercing rounds loaded and instructed his crew to hold fire until targets were clearly identified. Ammunition was limited. Every shot had to count. By 5:30 a.m., the first Soviet tanks emerged from the fog. The attack was broad but disorganized. Visibility was poor. Some T-34s veered around shell craters. Others slowed to avoid anti-tank ditches hidden beneath standing water. Soviet artillery pounded the German line, but the shelling was scattered and often inaccurate because of the weather. Sokolov's T-34 advanced in second position behind another tank from his company. Through the periscope, he could barely see the rear silhouette ahead. The radio hissed with static and broken commands. He urged Antonov to maintain speed. Momentum was essential. A moving tank was harder to hit. A stalled tank was an easy target. Though at first, the T-34 performed as expected. The wide tracks spread its weight across the saturated ground. The suspension rocked but held firm. The diesel engine produced a deep, steady growl. Water streamed along the hull sides. Then the lead tank swerved abruptly to avoid a shell crater hidden beneath brown water. Antonov reacted instantly, turning left. The T-34's left track dropped into a patch of deep clay. The right track climbed slightly onto firmer ground. The 30-ton hull twisted and sank. Antonov accelerated. Mud sprayed from the rear. The engine reached a high, desperate pitch. The track spun, but found no purchase. Instead of moving forward, the tank settled deeper. Inside the turret, Sokolov felt the sickening sensation every tanker feared. The vehicle was no longer under his control. He ordered Voronin to prepare a high explosive round. Enemy anti-tank guns were expected ahead, but he still had not located them. Through the optics, he saw only fog and distant flashes. Pavel Yegorov transmitted a short message to company headquarters. Vehicle bogged. Continuing engagement. There was no answer. Across the field, Oberfeldwebel Brenner watched through his binoculars. He saw the Soviet tank lurch, stop, and begin throwing mud. He did not hesitate. Target, T-34, front, 700 meters. Hans Richter settled into the sight. The long 75mm gun was already aligned. The target was partially angled, but stationary. Armor-piercing. Dieter Falk rammed the shell into the breech. Richter exhaled. At 5:41 a.m., the Panzer IV fired. The recoil slammed backward. Smoke filled the turret, but Brenner kept his eyes fixed on the target. The shell crossed the field in less than a second. It struck the lower front hull of the T-34 with a sharp metallic crack. Inside the Soviet tank, sparks exploded around the driver's compartment. Fragments of steel ricocheted through the cramped interior. Pavel Yegorov cried out as splinters tore into his shoulder. Antonov was stunned but still conscious. The armor had not been fully penetrated, but the impact had damaged internal fittings and filled the hull with smoke. Sokolov shouted for the source of the shot. Antonov tried once more to move. The engine roared. The tank did not budge. Now the Panzer IV crew knew they had time. Richter adjusted slightly higher. Second round loaded. Fire. The second shell struck the turret ring area, one of the T-34's vulnerable points. Yet the impact jammed the turret traverse. Sokolov attempted to swing the gun, but the mechanism resisted. Voronin and Sokolov strained together to rotate the turret manually. It moved only a few degrees. Outside, the lead Soviet tank ahead finally noticed the German position and fired blindly into the tree line. The shell detonated nearby, showering dirt over Brenner's Panzer IV, but causing no serious damage. Brenner remained calm. His target was still helpless. Third round. Richter aimed at the right side of the turret, where the armor angle was less favorable. The gun thundered again. This time the armor failed. The 75mm shell penetrated the fighting compartment. Molten metal and fragments burst inside the turret. Loader, Alexei Voronin, was killed instantly. Sokolov was thrown backward, his face cut by shrapnel. Yet the interior lights flickered, smoke thickened. Hot brass and shattered steel covered the floor. You can almost hear the ringing in their ears, the choking air, the sudden realization that the tank has become a steel trap. Yet the T-34 was not burning. Sokolov was still alive, and as long as the gun could fire, there was still a chance. He forced himself back to the site. Voronin lay motionless. The turret was jammed, but pointed roughly toward the German position. Antonov could not move the tank, but the cannon remained loaded. Sokolov ordered Yegorov, bleeding heavily, to take over loading duties. The wounded radio operator dragged a shell from the rack and shoved it into the breach. Sokolov peered through smoke and found a dark shape near the trees. He fired. The T-34's 76mm gun erupted with a violent blast. As the recoil rocked the immobilized tank, the shell struck near Brenner's position, tearing branches and earth from the tree line. Fragments clattered across the Panzer IV's armor. Richter lost the target for a moment as dust and smoke obscured the field. Brenner shifted slightly backward to gain a clearer angle. The Panzer IV moved only a few meters, but it was enough. Fourth round loaded. Richter aimed carefully at the same penetration point in the turret. Fire! The shell entered through weakened armor and detonated ammunition stored along the hull side. For an instant, nothing happened. Then flames burst from the turret hatches. The explosion blew smoke and burning debris into the rain-soaked air. Inside, Sokolov and Antonov were mortally wounded. Yegorov collapsed beside the breach. The T-34, which had survived 2 direct hits and managed 1 final shot, was now engulfed in fire. At 5:45 a.m., the Soviet tank was officially out of action. Brenner observed the burning vehicle for several seconds. No crew emerged. He ordered his gunner to search for the next target. The battle around them continued. Other Soviet tanks pressed forward. Some bypassed the wreck. Others became trapped in the same muddy depression. German anti-tank guns and tanks exploited every pause. The field soon filled with black smoke and burning steel. Rain continued to fall, mixing with oil and fuel. By midday, the Soviet assault had failed. The 84th Tank Brigade lost dozens of vehicles in repeated attacks. German defensive positions held. Although individual crews displayed extraordinary courage, poor visibility, difficult terrain, and well-positioned German armor inflicted severe losses. The wreck of Sokolov's T-34 remained in the mud for weeks. Burned paint peeled from the turret. The left track, still partially buried, marked the exact point where momentum had been lost. German troops passing the area later noted that the tank had nearly reached firmer ground. Another 2 or 3 meters might have changed everything. The duel between the T-34-76 and the Panzer IV represented a larger truth about the Eastern Front. The T-34 was a remarkable design. Its armor shape and mobility forced Germany to rethink tank development. It could perform brilliantly in open maneuver warfare. In skilled hands, it was a deadly opponent. The Panzer IV, however, had become far more dangerous than many Soviet commanders realized. With the long 75mm gun, improved ammunition, and an experienced crews, it could penetrate T-34 armor at combat ranges once considered safe. German optics and communications often allowed faster target acquisition and more coordinated fire. On paper, the T-34's wide tracks offered superior mobility in mud. In practice, no tank was immune to terrain. Shell craters, uneven ground, and sudden steering corrections could trap even the most capable vehicle. Once stationary, the advantages of sloped armor diminished rapidly under repeated fire. Crew training also mattered enormously. German crews typically trained extensively in gunnery, communication, and target engagement. Each crew member had a specialized role. The commander could focus on observing the battlefield and issuing orders. In early T-34s, the commander often doubled as gunner, increasing stress during combat. This design limitation reduced situational awareness at precisely the moments when seconds determined survival. Yet Soviet crews adapted with extraordinary resilience. They fought in tanks with rough ergonomics, limited visibility, and often incomplete maintenance support. They learned quickly, endured immense casualties, and steadily improved their tactics. The sacrifice of crews like Sokolov's helped buy time during the darkest months of the war. As 1943 and 1944 progressed, Soviet tank forces became increasingly effective. Improved command structures, better radios, and enhanced training allowed T-34 units to operate with greater coordination. Later models, including the T-34-85, introduced a 3-man turret that dramatically improved battlefield performance. The Panzer IV continued serving with distinction, but the strategic balance began to shift. Soviet industry produced tanks in vast numbers. Operational experience sharpened doctrine. German units faced growing shortages of fuel, spare parts, and trained personnel. Still, in late 1942, on a muddy field near Stalingrad, those future developments were invisible to the men inside the tanks. All that mattered was traction. A few lost seconds, and the first shot. If you stand in that field in your mind, you can almost hear the fading echo of the Panzer IV's gun. Rain falls softly on twisted armor. Steam rises from a disabled engine. The mud that trapped the T-34 slowly hardens around its tracks. Inside the blackened hull, the battle is over, but the story does not end there. The lessons of such encounters shaped every armored force in the world. Mobility, visibility, communication, and crew coordination proved just as important as armor thickness and gun caliber. The strongest tank could become helpless if terrain stole its momentum. The most experienced crew could be lost if they hesitated. For the soldiers who fought in these machines, war was intensely personal. It was not about statistics or design diagrams. It was about cramped compartments, frozen hands, and split-second decisions made under terrifying pressure. Junior Lieutenant Ivan Sokolov and his crew likely knew the risks better than anyone. They climbed into their T-34 before dawn, aware that many would not return. They advanced anyway. Even after being hit, they loaded one more shell and fired back. That final act speaks to the determination that defined the Eastern Front. Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner and his crew demonstrated the other side of armored warfare: discipline, patience, and precision. They waited in concealment, recognized a fleeting opportunity, and executed their task with ruthless efficiency. Neither crew could know how history would remember their machines. To them, the T-34 and Panzer IV were not icons. They were tools of survival. On that October morning, the mud decided when one tank stopped, training decided who reacted faster, and a single German shell decided who fired first. The battlefield west of Stalingrad eventually fell silent, but thousands of similar duels continued across Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and Germany. Some lasted minutes, others were decided in a single second. In each case, steel, weather, and human nerve combined in ways no blueprint could fully predict. That the T-34 would go on to become one of the most celebrated tanks in history. The Panzer IV would remain Germany's most important workhorse tank. Both earned their reputations through countless encounters like this one, where victory belonged not to the most famous machine, but to the crew that maintained composure when everything went wrong. And it all began with one hidden patch of mud, one stalled track, one brief moment of helplessness. Then the Panzer IV fired first.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.